On the night of April 5th into the 6th, 2026, a Ukrainian drone found a ship sitting in the Kerch Strait, the narrow 15-kilometer stretch of water that separates Russia's mainland from occupied Crimea. The ship was called the Slavyanin. It was a railway ferry, and it was, according to Ukraine's main Directorate of Military Intelligence, the last railway ferry Russia had left afloat in the Kerch Strait. Ukraine's intelligence called the operation finishing off the vessel, and when the drone struck and the fire spread across the Slavyanin's deck and the footage circulated, showing the burning hulk listing in the dark water of the strait, that fire was not just destroying a ship. It was severing the last thread of a supply chain that Russia had spent years and billions of dollars trying to protect. Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence reported having put Russia's last remaining railway ferry in the Kerch Strait out of action, striking the Slavyanin with drones overnight into April 6th. HUR described the operation as having finished off the vessel and called it the last railway ferry of the occupiers in the Kerch Strait still afloat. According to HUR, the Slavyanin had been supplying Russian forces in occupied Crimea with fuel and lubricants, weapons, military equipment, and ammunition. Fuel, weapons, military equipment, ammunition, everything Russia needs to sustain 60,000 troops across the southern front. Everything that flows into Crimea and out to the forces that Russia has positioned across occupied Kherson and Zaporizhia. And the vessel carrying it was gone, not damaged, not temporarily disabled, destroyed as an operational asset on the same night that a previously unknown railway bridge inside Crimea was also struck. A bridge that Russian authorities had never publicly acknowledged, that had been quietly carrying the logistics load that the Kerch Bridge could no longer handle, that military analysts began calling the secret bridge when images of its damaged railway carriages and twisted tracks circulated the following morning. A crucial, yet previously obscured railway bridge in Crimea was severely damaged in a bold attack on April 7th, 2026, significantly disrupting Russian military logistics. This bridge, often referred to as the secret bridge due to the limited public knowledge of its existence and function, ran parallel to the better-known Kerch Bridge and served as a vital artery for transporting Russian troops, equipment, and supplies to the front lines. Images widely circulating on social media showed derailed railway carriages, twisted and fractured track sections, and substantial structural damage. Russia had a backup. The world knew about the Kerch Bridge, the $4 billion structure that Putin personally drove across in a truck, that became the symbol of Russian control over Crimea, that Ukraine had been attacking since 2022 with surface drones and underwater explosives and Storm Shadow missiles. Russia knew Ukraine knew about it, so Russia built a backup route, a parallel railway connection that was not publicized, not mapped openly, not discussed in Russian media, a shadow artery designed specifically to survive the targeting of the primary one. And Ukraine found it. And on the same night that the last railway ferry in the Kerch Strait was destroyed, Ukraine struck the secret bridge too, both gone, the same night. The primary ferry route and the backup railway corridor simultaneously taken offline in a coordinated operation that demonstrated exactly the kind of intelligence-driven, sequentially planned strike campaign that Ukraine has been developing for 2 years. This was not a lucky hit. This was a campaign reaching its decisive phase. To understand why this matters as profoundly as it does, you have to understand the full picture of what had already been done to Russia's Crimean supply chain before April 6th. Because the Slavyanin was not destroyed in isolation. It was the last piece of a systematic dismantling that had been months in the making. The Kerch Bridge has been weakened to the extent that only light vehicles like passenger cars can use it. The railroad tracks are damaged in too many places to keep them in repair, so the railroad across the bridge can no longer be used on a regular basis. Russia gave up trying to repair it and instead began using a longer 720-kilometer railroad from Rostov-on-Don to the port of Melitopol, where an existing rail line continues to Crimea. The Kerch Bridge, the crown jewel, the structure Putin said demonstrated Russia's mastery over Crimea, has been reduced to a one-lane civilian crossing. The railway section that carried military freight, that moved the heavy equipment and ammunition and fuel that 60,000 troops require, is too damaged to use reliably. Russia gave up repairing it and switched to the 720-kilometer overland route through occupied Ukrainian territory, through Melitopol, through the land corridor that Russia seized in 2022 specifically to create this alternative. Russia built redundancy into its Crimea supply chain specifically because it knew Ukraine would attack the bridge. In March 2026, HUR's Active Operations Department disabled the Avangard ferry in a strike that also damaged the Slavyanin. The Slavyanin apparently remained operational after the March damage, before Ukraine hit it again on April 6th. Ukrainian strikes early in the all-out war damaged the railway section of the Kerch Bridge, forcing Russia to restrict heavy loads on it. The systematic pattern: strike the Kerch Bridge railway, done. Damage the Avangard ferry, done. Hit the Slavyanin, done. Find and destroy the secret backup bridge inside Crimea, done. Each successive strike closed another valve in Russia's logistical pipeline, forcing it to route supplies through whatever remained, until what remained was the 720-kilometer land corridor through occupied Ukrainian territory. And that corridor is itself now under relentless pressure. Ukraine has sharply expanded its middle strike campaign, with drones hitting Russian logistics nodes, supply routes, command posts, and units at a depth of up to 120 to 150 kilometers behind the front line. Ukrainian forces have been intensifying their mid-range strike campaign against Russian ground lines of communication since late December and have markedly increased the intensity and frequency of such strikes since March. One Ukrainian unit posted that there is no safe rear area for the occupiers. There is nowhere to hide and no way to protect themselves. No safe rear area. The 720-kilometer land route from Rostov to Melitopol passes through territory that Ukraine's middle-range drones now patrol continuously. Supply trucks moving along those roads are hunted. Railway lines carrying military freight are struck. Fuel depots that receive deliveries are targeted before they can distribute to forward units. The land corridor exists on the map. It is increasingly unable to perform its function at the scale Russia requires, because Ukraine has turned the entire depth of occupied territory into a drone kill zone where nothing moves safely, and everything that does move risks being found. Every Russian vehicle and electronic device in Crimea relies on imported fuel. Crimea is now effectively blockaded by Ukrainian forces. No more fuel gets into Russian-occupied Crimea. When the last of it is used, Russian-occupied Crimea will be defenseless, effectively blockaded. That assessment, from Strategy Page, which has been tracking the Crimea logistics situation for 2 years with meticulous detail, uses language that should stop every analyst who has been predicting that Crimea's physical inaccessibility makes it permanently secure for Russia. A blockade does not require ships. It does not require a naval battle. It requires the systematic denial of every route by which supplies can move. And Ukraine has now denied or severely degraded every route Russia had. The ferry route, gone. The secret backup railway bridge, struck. The Kerch Bridge Railway, unusable for heavy freight. The land corridor, under sustained drone attack across its entire length. As of May 12, 2026, an estimated 60,000 Russian troops across the southern front are effectively stranded. The land bridge is no longer a bridge. It is a graveyard for Russian logistics. No supplies, no fuel, no reinforcements, no way out. The fuel crisis is hitting Crimea directly. 60,000. The number of Russian troops across the southern front, whose supply situation has been transformed from difficult to genuinely critical by the events of April and May 2026. These are not troops at the front line of the Donetsk fighting. These are the forces Russia positioned across occupied Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, the troops that guard the land corridor itself, the garrison forces in Crimea, the rear area logistics and command elements that sustain the entire southern axis of Russia's occupation. And they are running on the fuel and ammunition and food that was already in place when the supply routes closed, drawing down reserves that cannot be replenished at the rate they are being consumed. The fuel dimension is particularly acute. Military vehicles run on fuel. Tanks cannot move without it. Trucks cannot carry ammunition without it. Helicopters cannot fly without it. Generators that power command centers and radar systems and communication equipment run on fuel. A military force that is cut off from fuel resupply is not a degraded force. It is a force that is counting down to immobility. And once immobile, it is a force that cannot maneuver, cannot retreat, and cannot defend against an enemy that can still move. And it is not just the supply routes that are gone. The air route, the option of flying supplies to Crimea when ground and sea routes are compromised, is also being closed. A Russian military An-26 transport aircraft crashed in occupied Crimea during a scheduled flight in late March 2026 after communications were lost. Military-linked Russian sources reported the aircraft had been carrying approximately 30 military personnel. The Antonov An-26 is often employed to move service members, equipment, and supplies rapidly across regional airfields, especially where larger transport aircraft may be impractical. Crimea remains a key rear area logistics node for Russian military activity in the Black Sea region and Southern Theater, making regular transport flights over the peninsula routine. A transport aircraft carrying troops goes down over Crimea, at the same time that Ukrainian naval drones are hunting in the waters around the peninsula, that Ukrainian aerial drones have demonstrated the ability to reach Sevastopol harbor and strike warships, that Ukrainian long-range missiles have struck Belbek airfield and its facilities. The airspace over Crimea is not declared closed, but it is contested in ways that make routine supply flights an increasingly dangerous proposition. Russia's air bridge to Crimea carries the same degradation risk as every other route. Now understand what the numbers on the broader battlefield tell you about the consequences of this logistical strangulation, because the supply chain collapse in Crimea and the southern front is not a separate story from the collapse in Russian territorial gains. They are the same story. In the period of April 14th to May 12th, 2026, Russian forces saw a net loss of 45 square miles of Ukrainian territory, according to ISW data. During the previous 4-week period, Russian forces registered a net loss of 1 square mile. In the past week of May 5 to 12, Russia lost 12 square miles, following a loss of 21 square miles in the previous week. The acceleration is unmistakable. 1 square mile of net loss in a month, then 45 square miles in the following month, then 12 square miles in a single week. Russia is losing ground faster every week, not slower. And the losses are not random. They're concentrated in exactly the areas where the logistical pressure is most intense, where Ukrainian drone interdiction of supply routes has most degraded Russia's ability to sustain defensive positions. A unit that is low on ammunition cannot hold ground the way a fully supplied unit can. A position that cannot be reinforced because the resupply route is under constant drone attack will eventually fall. Russia's total combat losses, since the start of its full-scale invasion through May 14, 2026, are estimated at approximately 1,345,240 personnel, including 1,060 troops lost over the past 24 hours, 1,345,000, and 1,060 in the 24 hours before this report was published. The rate of Russian losses has not slowed. It has not been reduced by the territorial reverses. The Russian military continues feeding its soldiers into a conflict whose terms have shifted fundamentally against it, where the territory it holds is shrinking, where its supply lines to the most strategically important terrain it occupies are severed or severely degraded, and where the weapon system that is causing 75 to 80% of those casualties is being produced by its enemy at greater scale every month. Russia's military logistics in Crimea are collapsing under relentless Ukrainian strikes. For the first time in nearly 3 years, momentum in the war appears to shift toward Ukraine, as Russian forces lose ground and face mounting drone-driven losses. FPV drones are reshaping the battlefield, neutralizing tanks and turning the war into a grinding battle of attrition that could ultimately determine the fate of Putin's invasion. The former Navy SEAL commander being quoted there, a man with decades of experience in exactly the kind of asymmetric warfare that Ukraine has been conducting, is describing a shift in momentum that military analysts have been cautious about declaring for years because previous apparent shifts proved temporary. This one appears different, not because of a single dramatic battle, not because of one successful strike, but because the underlying system, the logistical architecture that sustains Russia's military position across the southern front and in Crimea, is being methodically dismantled at exactly the moment when Russia's rate of advance has collapsed to nearly nothing, and its casualty rate has exceeded its recruitment capacity for 5 consecutive months. Logistics is not glamorous. It does not generate the images that dominate war coverage. No dramatic explosion, no advancing column of tanks, no moment of visible triumph. What it generates is a slow, invisible pressure that builds and builds until it becomes visible in the things that stop happening. Trucks that stop moving. Artillery that stops firing because the shells are not arriving. Positions that stop being reinforced because the route to reinforce them is under constant drone attack. And eventually, not immediately, not next week, but on a timeline that is now measurable in months rather than years, a military force that has been cut off from its supply chain stops being a military force and becomes an isolated garrison waiting for terms. Crimea is stripped of its radars, anti-aircraft systems and warships normally based there, and is now largely defenseless. When the last fuel is used, Russian-occupied Crimea will be defenseless, and Ukrainian forces can walk in and take over. Walk in and take over. That phrase, from an analyst who has been tracking Russian military logistics in Crimea since 2022, describes what the current trajectory is building toward. Not immediately, not in a single dramatic assault, but as the logical endpoint of a process that is already well advanced. The Black Sea Fleet is gone from Sevastopol. The radar networks have been progressively blinded. The air defense systems have been repeatedly struck. The Kerch Bridge Railway is out of service for heavy loads. The ferry route is destroyed. The secret backup bridge is damaged. The land corridor is under sustained drone interdiction, and 60,000 troops are drawing down the fuel and ammunition that was already in place, with no reliable way to replenish it. Putin built a $4 billion bridge to Crimea. He drove across it in a truck. He called it a miracle. He made it the symbol of Russia's permanent hold on the peninsula he seized in 2014. And Ukraine, systematically, methodically, piece by piece, and route by route, has reduced that symbol and everything it was meant to sustain to a peninsula that is militarily isolated, logistically starved, and counting down toward the moment when the last supply runs out. Russia's main Crimea lifeline is gone. The troops are isolated, and the clock is running.